Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in about a minute or so. All right, everyone, we have a few people who are trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to our webinar, What's the Status of Federal Funding for Safe Routes to School, Walking, and Bicycling? Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to have you here and have this very important and timely conversation about federal funding. My name is Corey Johnson. I'm the Program Support Manager here at Safe Routes Partnership. Welcome. I have a few housekeeping slides to go over, and I'll pass it over to our presenter for today. For those of you who are new to Safe Routes Partnership, welcome. We're a national organization whose mission is to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and in everyday life, improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, and abilities, and building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. And for those of you who already are familiar with us, welcome back. It's nice to have you. So for those of you who are need like a Zoom refresher, so everybody should be on mute and no video, so everybody should be in listen-only mode. You can join audio through your computer or your phone. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, which you can use to submit questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A box for that. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. And we're also providing a live transcription, which should be scrolling at the bottom of your screen. And we're also recording the session. The video will be available on our website probably later on this afternoon, along with a copy of the presentation. So please look out for that. And we'll also be sending out a survey at the end so that we can make sure we get your feedback and that we can continue to provide great webinars for you all. So please keep an eye out for the survey too. And just to get started, we want to get a sense of who's joining us today. So who is in our Zoom room? So we would like for you all to let us know what sector or field of work you're representing or involved with. So I'll go ahead and launch the poll. Feel free to choose whatever options best apply to you. Keep it open for about 30 seconds. Wait about 10 more seconds. Get your final answers in. Last call. All right, so thank you to those of you who participated. So it looks like we have a mix actually. So a lot of local government people, a few state and local health departments, state DOTs we have, Safe Routes to School, which is great, some bike ped folks, and some federal government people. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our wonderful presenter, Marisa, who will be walking us through our federal funding webinar today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Marisa, it is all you.
Thanks so much, Corey, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really delighted to be here to talk with you about what the status of federal funding for safe routes to school, walking, and bicycling is currently. As Corey mentioned, my name is Marisa Jones. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Safe Routes Partnership, and I live and work out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I've been with the partnership for 6 years, and the majority of that time I've spent working on state and local policies, and I see a lot of familiar faces or names in the participant list, and have really had the great opportunity to work with many of you on this call, and in the past year have stepped into the role working on federal policy. And it's been great to be able to bring the experience of working with and interacting with so many state and local advocates, organizations, departments of transportation, departments of health, city elected officials, and agency staff that really helps inform the advocacy at the federal level. When we sent out the invitation for this webinar, we thought surely by October 14th, we'll know what's going on with federal funding for walking, biking, and safe routes to school. And we're still in a state of flux. And so I really just want to share right now that the information that I'm presenting on today's webinar is accurate as of today, which is October 14th, 2021. The status of federal funding is a moving target right now. It's an evolving situation. And the information that I'm presenting here today is subject to change. So really just want to share this for anybody that's watching the webinar after October 14th. Be sure to see what's happened in the time since viewing this. And I also put a reminder about this on many of the slides, just so that everyone knows things might be different by the time you rewatch this or revisit the slide deck. We have a lot to cover today, and I apologize, this is going to be a lot of just me talking and sharing information at you, but it's got a lot to get through. So I'm going to start by providing a quick recap of the Fafsa Act. I'm going to talk about where things currently stand for surface transportation reauthorization. I'll then talk about, I think, what most people are really here for, which is what are the changes to federal policy and funding related to safe routes to school, walking and biking when or if surface transportation is reauthorized. I'll also provide a very brief overview of new and revised discretionary grant programs, and I'll provide some ideas for how you might prepare for when or if this bill becomes law. And then I've left a lot of time for questions and answers at the end. And to head off the #1 question that we get on every webinar, and Corey already said this too, but the slide deck and recording will be shared following the webinar. Okay, so a quick recap of the Fafsa Act. This is the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. It was signed into law by President Obama in 2015, and it authorized federal surface transportation spending and policy through 2020. In the last Congress wasn't able to come to an agreement on how to reauthorize surface transportation funding, so they passed a continuing resolution, which means level funding and no policy changes through September 30th of 2021. We have an infographic on our website for those of you interested in the history of federal funding for safe routes to school through 3 transportation bills, and I put that link here at the bottom of our website, of our slides. So, as I mentioned, this continuing resolution authorized the Fafsa Act through September 30th, 2021. And we knew that there were 3 possible outcomes that would happen after September 30th. Congress could let the Fafsa Act expire, it could pass a continuing resolution to extend current funding levels and policy, or it could reauthorize surface transportation and President Biden could sign it into law. So what has happened? What is the status? Well, for starters, Congress did let the Fafsa Act expire for 1 day. There were impacts, including furloughs of DOT staff, of US DOT staff, and some trickle-down ramifications for state governments' ability to implement the Transportation Alternatives Program. But fortunately, the next day, Congress passed a continuing resolution, which again is level funding and no policy change, to extend current funding levels and policy through the end of this month, October 2021. And what we're continuing to work toward and hope for is that Congress will reauthorize surface transportation and it will become law. So while I don't really want to get into the politics because I know that can be sort of dispiriting, I think it's important for people to understand why the first two outcomes happen and sort of where the holdup with the reauthorization of surface transportation is. So you may have been hearing the word infrastructure a lot. That's definitely the buzzword on Capitol Hill and in headlines. And so I want to just point out the two elements of infrastructure that are being deliberated on Capitol Hill right now. So first, there's a physical infrastructure bill. And this is really about large-scale investment in public works. This has a lot of names. You may have been hearing about it. Its actual bill name is called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. You may be hearing about it as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill or the BIB, or iterations of that, the BIF, the BID, or simply called the Infrastructure Bill. So an important thing to note is that the infrastructure bill, the BIB, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, includes the full text of surface transportation reauthorization, which unanimously passed out of the Environment and Public Works Committee. The whole of that was incorporated into this infrastructure bill, which passed the Senate in August 2021. The other element of infrastructure that you might be hearing about is what's being referred to as human infrastructure. And so this is a bill that's aimed at investing in systems that support people. The formal title for this is called the Build Back Better Act. This is a partisan bill. It's expected that only Democrats will support this bill, and as such, it will be passed through budget reconciliation. So what's in that bill? It includes provisions aimed at combating climate change, creating paid family leave, universal pre-K, expanding the social safety net for families, Medicare expansion, and a lot more. So as a political decision, Speaker Pelosi has decided to link these two bills. So although the physical infrastructure bill has already passed the Senate, she has determined that she will not bring the infrastructure bill, the BIB, to the floor until human infrastructure, the Build Back Better Act, has passed the Senate, or at the very least, there's an agreed upon framework. And this is also, I think it's also important to note that the House passed its own surface transportation bill earlier this spring. It's called the Invest Act, and they have agreed to accept the Senate version, provided that it remains linked with the human infrastructure bill, Build Back Better. So what's going on with that? There are centrist senators that oppose the bill as it's currently written, and they're actively, or they must negotiate with their Senate colleagues as well as their House counterparts to determine what a palatable top line cost is. And then an additional challenge is that House moderates oppose the linkage of the human infrastructure bill, Build Back Better, with the physical infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So just sharing that that's what's going on. These two bills are linked together, and so they're wending their way through the process in tandem, which slows things down. There's a lot more to negotiate and deliberate, but that's where they're at right now. So let's get to the heart of what I think many of you are here today to learn about, which is what is in these bills for safe routes to school, walking, and bicycling. And before I dive into exactly what's in those bills, I want to acknowledge our bill sponsors and committee chairs on both the House and the Senate side who have been instrumental in leading on and making these changes. So I'm not going to read them out, but they're on here. And similarly, I want to thank our partner, the League of American Bicyclists. All of our lobbying work in DC is done in strong partnership in tandem with the League of American Bicyclists. And third, I want to thank you, our friends, our network, our fields, for all of your input, experience, and insight into how to make the Transportation Alternatives Program work better, how to make it more impactful, more equitable, how to facilitate the implementation for state DOTs and MPOs and local governments. So I hope that some of the challenges or impediments to accessing this program that many of you have shared with us over the years are improved upon and changed and made better in this bill that we hope becomes law. So again, just restating, this bill is not yet law. We hope that it will become law. None of these changes that I'm about to share have already happened, but they're in the bill language. So I'm going to highlight four elements, four things. So I'm going to highlight what's in the infrastructure bill that is specific for safe routes to school. I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the Transportation Alternatives Program. I will talk briefly about the Highway Safety Improvement Program and also about discretionary grants that would be run through the U.S. Department of Transportation. Okay, so for starters, what's in the infrastructure bill for safe routes to school? So one of the things that we are really delighted to share is that the infrastructure bill brings safe routes to school into current law. So what does this mean? The way that it's been for the Fafsa Act and for MAP 21 was a reference to the original 2005 Safety Lieu law. And so what this bill does is it takes that text that's in like a hidden note and pulls it into US code. And so it codifies safe routes to school into current law. And what is really important about this is that it conveys congressional support for this program. So although Congress couldn't come to an agreement about how to set aside money for many of the things that I know a lot of us would love to see, it does convey to state departments of transportation and decision makers that we as Congress like this program. We liked elements of it like the clearinghouse and coordinators. And so all of that is in there, but there's no set aside specific for things like the clearinghouse. And so as a result, the way that the text is written, those things will not be required by law. But we do see this as an opportunity to encourage decision makers and state departments of transportation to look at that congressional intent and reflect it in their administration of the Transportation Alternatives Program. Another exciting thing that's in this bill for safe routes to school is that it expands eligibility to high schools in addition to elementary and middle schools. And then another thing that is great, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about Highway Safety Improvement Program, is that it allows up to 10% of Highway Safety Improvement Program dollars to be used for safe routes to school non-infrastructure. So it opens up another source of funds to pay for things like education and encouragement activities. Okay, next I am going to talk about the Transportation Alternatives Program. I'm imagining that if you're tuning into this webinar, you know what this program is. Either you administer it or you've accessed it before, or you've applied for it. But just in case anyone is less familiar with it, it is the major federal source of transportation funding for walking, biking, and safe routes to school. It's currently funded at $850 million a year. And uniquely, this program is designed to support local priorities. So a state Department of Transportation or metropolitan planning organization competes out the funds rather than self-determines what to do with it. And it requires a local match of up to 20%. Okay, so with that, I'm going to dive into the nitty-gritty of what this bill changes with regard to transportation alternatives. So for starters, and possibly the thing we're most excited about, is that it increases funding for the Transportation Alternatives Program significantly. So one thing it does is that it makes transportation alternatives a percentage of the Surface Transportation Block Grant rather than having it as a fixed dollar amount. Why is this exciting? Our hope is that the Transportation Alternatives Program will then grow in proportion to other programs. So the other great thing here is that funding will be increased by 60%. So as I mentioned, it's currently funded at $850 million a year. If passed, this would increase in FY22 to $1.38 billion. And then by 2026, that would increase to $1.49 billion. So across all 5 years, that would represent a $2.5 billion increase in investments for safe routes to school, walking, biking, other improvements to support walking and wheeling. So the next thing that I want to share is what this bill does to make access to these funds more equitable. So it will require state departments of transportation to define and prioritize high-need communities in their application and project selection process. I included a map on here from our biannual state report cards on walking, biking, and safe routes to school, where we identified 18 states that provide special consideration for high need communities. So there are states that are already doing this, and there was great interest and acceptance by members of Congress to figure out ways to make this money, these funds more accessible. Before I dive into the next changes, I thought it would be helpful to just quickly review how the transportation alternatives dollars flow from the federal government through state DOTs and MPOs to actual projects. So each state receives its apportionment. After the recreational trail set aside is taken off, the transportation alternatives funds go into two pots of money. So 50% of those funds are up to the state DOT to decide what to do with. That can then take two paths. Either the state can choose to transfer these funds away from walking and biking, or it can run a statewide competition for communities of any size anywhere in the state. The second pot of money is the population pot of money. So this money gets competed out either by a state or by an NPO, and the funds are proportionally divided into three pots based on a state's population. So this is where the bill is set up to make sure that funding goes to urbanized areas, to areas with fewer than 5,000 people, like where I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and communities with between 5 and 200,000 people. So what will this bill do that will change the look and feel of this flow chart? Oh my. Sorry, y'all. Got excited. Okay, my goodness. So the first thing that it will do is it will make changes to the percentages of money going into each of those pots, the state pot and the population pot. This will shift more money into the pot that is competed out based on the size of a community. So you can see here that this bill would shift 41% into the state DOT full statewide competition pot and 59% to be competed out based on community size. So another hugely significant thing that's in this bill that we are so excited about is that this bill would prevent states from transferring money out of the Transportation Alternatives Program before giving communities a first crack at that money. And so states will have to certify that they held a competition, they provided technical assistance, and there were no adequate projects before they can transfer funds to other uses. Why is this important? So we know that roughly half of applications to the Transportation Alternatives Program nationwide get funded, half of them. And so between 2016 and 2019, that represented $6.7 billion in unmet need. So $6.7 billion worth of projects that did not get funded. And so when states are transferring money to other uses, they're leaving projects and local governments and safe routes to school programs in their communities that want this funding unable to access those funds. So again, that will shift our flow chart. It will just make it a little, there will be more steps required before a state can easily just send that money to a different use. So there are a number of other provisions in this bill that are intended to improve access for local governments and local control. So one of these is that it would allow states to sub-allocate all of their funds. If a state decided to and had all the correct provisions in place, it could directly sub-allocate to local governments. Another one that we're really excited about, because we expect that it will streamline project delivery, is enabling large metropolitan planning organizations to obligate the funds for projects that they select, rather than waiting for a state to obligate those funds. And then another significant change is that small MPOs, those metropolitan planning organizations that serve urbanized areas with fewer than 200,000 people, were completely ineligible for transportation alternatives under the Fafsa Act. So this makes them eligible. And then additionally, it makes all nonprofits eligible to apply. Okay, I keep saying that I'm really excited about this one, or this one's really significant, and I don't want that to lose meaning, but this one is really exciting and significant. So this is about facilitating flexibility on the match requirement. So I shared that the Transportation Alternative Program requires a 20% match, or whatever a state's match requirement is based on percentage of federal land. And so this includes two ways to give states more flexibility to meet that local match requirement. So the first one is that it enables that local match requirement to be met at either the project level or the program level. So currently, every project has to come to the table with at least a 20% match. What this bill does is it allows that to be aggregated over all the projects. So if one project only had a 10% match, the state could say, sure, 10%, provided that that other 10% is made up on another project's application. Or it could say, this project can be done wholly with federal funds, and other projects will have to bring more than 20% to the table. And we think this is really important, particularly for smaller communities or more rural communities that have expressed that one of their greatest impediments to accessing these funds is the lack of local match. And then, as I alluded to in the Safe Routes to School element, this allows the Highway Safety Improvement Program funds to be used as a match for safety projects. And that includes Safe Routes to School. So a state DOT could decide to use its HSIP funds, Highway Safety Improvement Program funds, as that match for projects that improve safety for people walking and bicycling, which certainly includes Safe Routes to School. Another provision in this bill is that it enables state departments of transportation to use up to 5% of their transportation alternatives program apportionment to provide technical assistance to applicants. And that can look like a lot of different things. So that can be to staff the program in-house. It can be to pay for funding technical assistance to applicants. And in addition to in-house funding a staff person or a Safe Routes to School coordinator, this 5% can also be contracted out to other government agencies, nonprofits, or contractors. And at the Safe Routes Partnership, we have seen terrific models of Safe Routes to School being administered through a state DOT, or being contracted out to a nonprofit, or being administered by a state Department of Health. And so this puts some flexibility in there for how a state DOT wants to support and enable accessing these funds. And this is where I would go back to my earlier point about the importance and value of Congress bringing Safe Routes to School into current law to demonstrate congressional intent. And one of the things that they included in that was states having Safe Routes to School coordinators. And while they couldn't come up with the way to fund that, I am telling you that this is the way that you can do that. So connect, either if you work at a state DOT, considering that, or connecting with your state DOT to talk about potentially using these funds for either in-house or contracted out state Safe Routes to School coordination. This is a small change, but I'm personally very excited about it, which is it makes some updates to state reporting requirements that are going to make it easier to compare across states, which helps us track the implementation of the program. Okay, so those are the changes on the Transportation Alternatives Program. I'm now going to turn to the Highway Safety Improvement Program. So for those of you who are less familiar, this is a pot of funding that is available to keep people using our roads safe from injury, serious injury, and fatality. So every state gets an apportionment of these funds, and it's the state DOT decides what to do with that. And so that's the point of contrast with the Transportation Alternatives Program, where it's competed out, and local governments and others can compete for these funds. This is determined, the use of HSIP, Highway Safety Improvement Program, is determined at the state DOT level. As I mentioned, the intent of these funds is to keep road users safe. Where we currently stand with the use of HSIP funds is that the average state spending on projects to keep people walking and wheeling safe is 1% of HSIP funds. States spend an average of 1% of HSIP funds on keeping people walking and wheeling safe. Yet people walking and wheeling represent almost 20% of people who are killed on our roads. And so we view that as a mismatch, and a lot of our advocacy on Capitol Hill this year has focused on, hey, this is a pot of money that already exists for this purpose. How can we support state DOTs to align the intent of these funds with the impact on who is actually being injured and killed on our roads? And so how did that come out in this bill? So first, it integrates vulnerable road user safety by adding in provisions that define safety for all road users. It already included a litany of eligible projects, including something as general as projects to keep bicycle and pedestrians safe. I mean, those, don't quote me on that, but basically that. But this bill takes it a little further by clarifying traffic calming projects can be funded, bike lane and pedestrian separation can be funded. And then something that it was brought back pre-Fafsa Act. This was eligible and then it was tightened up under the Fafsa Act. So this is bringing it back, that states can use up to 10% of their HSIP funding on safety campaigns and non-infrastructure. And as I mentioned earlier, that includes safe routes to school, not infrastructure. Another thing that this bill does is that it proactively or clearly states that safe routes to school infrastructure projects are eligible for HSIP. So I put the asterisk here because that's not actually new in terms of permissibility or eligibility, but there was often some confusion about whether it was eligible or not because it wasn't explicitly stated. So it is now explicitly stated that HSIP funds can be used for safe routes to school infrastructure projects. This bill would also require states to complete a vulnerable road user safety assessment. And then importantly here, it would require states in which more than 15% of roadway fatalities are of vulnerable road users. It would require them to spend at least 15% of their HSIP funds to address vulnerable road user safety. And so when you think back to, I shared, the average state spending is 1%. If we're now going to have every state that has 15% or more of their roadway fatalities with people walking, wheeling, pushing strollers, using mobility devices, now needing to spend 15%, that will also be a significant increase in the investment in safety for people walking and wheeling. And our analysis is that that will impact 27 states in the coming year. So very, very briefly, I want to also go over some discretionary grants. And so the two programs that I just talked about are formula funds. So every state gets an apportionment based on a complicated formula that takes into account population and center line miles. And then discretionary grants are different. So these are fully competitive programs that are administered through the State Department of US DOT, United States Department of Transportation, whereas the formula programs are administered through state DOTs. So this is also when we talk about the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and I talked about how I copied and pasted the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, and then it added in elements from President Biden's American Jobs Plan. So these are some of the elements that were from the American Jobs Plan, and these are grant programs that will be competed out through US DOT. The first one is a Complete Streets program that will say that states need to develop complete street standards and project prioritization lists, and then provides planning funds for that. It's a grant to do that. The second thing is the Reconnecting Communities program. So this is a pilot program that's funded at $1 billion for highway removal in communities that were negatively impacted by highway construction. There's also the Safe Streets for All program, which is a $5 billion grant program to fund the development and implementation of Vision Zero plans. And I put an asterisk next to this for two reasons. The first one is that we are concerned about the lack of guardrails or safeguards around how these funds can be used for the enforcement of traffic laws. And so we're in conversations with DOT about what that could look like, but just want to flag that. And then the second thing is that there's also a lot of funding available for writing plans that may change down the road. So if you are from a community that's been wanting to develop a Vision Zero plan, that now might be your time. And I would also say that there are so many communities that say they've relied on enforcement as a central pillar of Vision Zero because of a lack of funds for the engineering that's needed to make our streets safer. And there are $5 billion available from the federal government. So apply for the engineering changes that will really make a difference. And then the fourth one that I want to highlight is RAISE, which is the Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. So this is the funding stream formerly known as BUILD, formerly known as TIGER. This is for really big, regionally significant projects. And there's increased funding in the infrastructure bill for RAISE. Okay, so all of that fit into the physical infrastructure box that I was talking about, that bill that has passed the Senate. Now we're going to turn to the other box, the human infrastructure box, the Build Back Better Act. I was a little bit nervous to include this because this is, the floor is shifting on this, or actually the ceiling on this is shifting more and more every day. And so I really want to impress upon you that the Build Back Better Act has not passed either Chamber of Commerce and the House, Chamber of Congress, and the House and Senate are actively negotiating how to cut the top line cost, which is $3.5 trillion, by almost half. So we don't know if these programs will be included in the final version, these two programs I'm going to talk about. And there's been some speculation that anything related to physical infrastructure will be the first to go because there's also this large investment in physical infrastructure. But I do just want to highlight these. And these were agreed upon by the House and Senate committees with jurisdiction over transportation. So the first is community climate incentive grants. And this is really funding focused on reducing surface transportation related greenhouse gas emissions. It establishes a greenhouse gas performance measure, and there's funding available for incentive grants that make progress in reducing emissions. Oopsies. I'm sorry. So then the second piece that's in the Build Back Better Act, but same caveats here apply, it's called the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grants. And this is $4 billion to support neighborhood equity, safety, and affordable transportation. And so this really takes that reconnecting communities from the physical infrastructure bill a step further by saying it's not just about removing infrastructure barriers that divide communities, it's also about creating safe and accessible networks in places where those barriers can't be removed. It includes a number of climate mitigation strategies, and not less than 40% of these funds are set aside for projects in disadvantaged or underserved communities, or in communities that have plans in place to ensure that these projects don't lead to gentrification or displacement of existing residents. But again, we don't know if those will stay in. Okay, now I want to turn to what you can do with this information now. So again, important reminder that none of that is law yet, but we really hope that it will become law. So things to consider and ways that you could start thinking about what you will do when or if this bill becomes law. So really the top message I want to convey here, especially to our state DOT friends who are on the call, is that the eligibility for what kinds of projects transportation alternatives can fund is not changing. So the same types of projects that have been eligible in the past are still eligible, and now there will be significantly more funding available. So we're encouraging state DOTs to, when this bill passes, continue administering and opening competitions for transportation alternatives, even while we're waiting on the Federal Highway Administration to write guidance, because the eligibility really has not changed. So the second thing I put on here, so this is speaking to both advocates and state DOTs. So as I mentioned, this the Highway Safety Improvement Program dollars can be used as a match for TAP. And that's a decision that will be made at the state DOT level. So if you work at the state DOT and you administer the Transportation Alternatives Program, find your colleague who administers HSIP, talk about the possibility of using HSIP as a match for TAP. If you're an advocate, connect with your Transportation Alternatives Program manager or HSIP manager at your state DOT and encourage the use of HSIP as a match for TAP. I meant on the slide where we talked about how the bill would improve equitable access to Transportation Alternatives Program funds. I included a map, and I also am including a link to academic research on practices that promote access to safe routes to school in vulnerable communities. And so this details out a number of strategies that have been used at the state level to get, it was at the time, federal safe routes to school funds to what they define as vulnerable communities. So for those of you that are just thinking about like, oh, how will we do this? What works? I encourage you to look at this research. Another one, consider what the best use of that 5% of technical assistance would be in your state. Again, this is something that will be decided by your state Department of Transportation, but perhaps you can have conversations and influence what that would be. For folks that no longer have statewide safe routes to school coordination, proposing that and hearkening back to when there was a state coordinator in your state under Safety Lou and talking about everything that could be accomplished could be one thing to advocate for. And then another message that I just want to convey here is, so I highlighted transportation alternatives, HSIP, and then 4 of those discretionary grants. There are a number of other eligibilities. There are a number of other programs and funding streams for which biking, walking, and safe routes to school are eligible. So just really encourage you to get creative and think about applying to lots of programs. So also with the caveat that transportation alternatives has just will have significantly more money than it has in the past. And then as I mentioned with the discretionary grant, if you want to develop a Vision Zero plan, apply for the planning funding in the early years, in like year 1 or year 2. And with that, I want to offer you a number of resources or links to resources. As we talked about at the beginning of this call, this is a moving target right now. There's a lot happening, and so I encourage you to follow along on our federal policy blog to stay apprised of what's happening on Capitol Hill related to safe routes to school, walking and biking. We also, every quarter, we put out a report that analyzes state implementation of the Transportation Alternatives Program. So we put the data out there and we offer some reflection. So if you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to take a look. The other thing that I would offer is we track every project that gets funded by Transportation Alternatives. We use that for when we meet with members of Congress to share, hey, this was built with these funds in your state. But if that information would ever be helpful for you, let us know. We can share that with you. And then also a link to our biannual state report cards on walking, biking, and physical activity. And so that also provides some analysis of state supportive practices and federal funding implementation related to safe routes to school. And you can always email me, my contact information is here. And with that, I see a lot of questions in the question box, and I'm excited to hopefully answer what questions you have.
Thanks, Marisa. That was a very great and comprehensive overview of what's happening. So really appreciate you putting all that together and taking the time to get us up to speed on what is happening up on the Hill. So I'm just going to start going ahead and going through some of our questions. I guess for those of you whose questions we don't get to, we'll save them and then post them on our blog. Is that right, Marisa?
Yes, thanks, Corey.
Okay, and you can also take a look at the questions too, if there's some that you see that are sticking out that you want to answer. Actually, a quick one. Somebody asked if I can post the Fast Act infographic in the chat. I will do that right now for you. Okay, so first question is, The best way for people to advocate on behalf of Fast Act and active transportation and safe routes to school funding. So for the advocates out there, what should people be thinking about and doing?
Yeah, great. So really important point of clarification, the FAST Act is our current bill. We want to shift to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So that is what we have been pounding the proverbial pavement advocating for. Honestly, at this point, like, unless you can convince Senators Manchin and Sinema to agree to a top line figure for human infrastructure, I'm not sure how much there is to do. You can certainly call your member of Congress, your House representative. The Senate has already passed this. You can express your support for this program. I will say that our organization supports the strategy of linking these two bills because we're an organization that's really focused on healthy communities. While we have been working relentlessly for all these changes in the physical infrastructure bill, as an organization dedicated to healthy, thriving, equitable communities, we also really want to see the human infrastructure bill passed. And so you can make a determination based on what is important to you, but you're certainly always welcome to reach out to your member of Congress and say that you support the Transportation Alternatives Program or Safe Routes to School. But yeah, at this point, we're mostly waiting on the human infrastructure element before this will be brought to the House floor for a vote.
Thanks, Marisa. We also have a few questions about if you can define technical assistance as it's defined in this legislation. I don't know if it's laid out that way, or like the expected level of effort in providing technical assistance.
Yeah, I would be happy to follow up with that on our blog. I can. I don't think me reading the legislation like aloud right now is going to be the most effective use. And so one of the things that I would convey is that 5% for technical assistance, it's, I don't want to say it's broadly defined, but it's also like there are probably 4 or 5 things that qualify. And this is where I was trying to say, like, this can be used for any support. It can be used for staffing. It can be used for, I think one of the things that specifically says is like anything that expedites or makes more efficient project delivery counts, but it also does talk about being able to use it to contract with other government agencies or nonprofits or public private sector contractors. But yeah, so 5% of the state's TAP apportionment can be used for that. And I'll provide more info on our blog about that.
Okay, so keep an eye out on our blog space. When you say MPO, does that also mean RPOs, rural planning organizations? Is that the same?
So yeah, thanks. In the context of who gets to compete out the funds, the sub-allocated funds, this is specifically metropolitan planning organizations serving urbanized areas over 200,000 people. And so going back to that slide where it has like the 2 pots of money and then the one that's based on population, the state competes out the funds for communities under 5,000, communities 5 to 200,000, and MPOs compete out the urbanized area projects. And that is like the strict definition of MPOs serving over 200,000 people. And that they are also the ones that would get the obligation authority for the projects that they select.
Great. Do you have any details on the vulnerable road users assessment and how you'd like to see that impact decision making?
Yeah.
It's also asked, do you have a list of states that have met the 15% vulnerable road users fatality threshold?
Yes, and I'm going to go back and watch the recording so that I remember what I'm going to commit to posting on our website. So our friends at the League of American Bicyclists have that list of states. So I will connect with them and share that out. So that's that answer. And then the other one, the details on the vulnerable road users assessment. Lots of details, probably more than is useful to go into right now on this call. But one of the things that I will say that we're excited about the vulnerable road user safety assessment is that it requires states to define what they're going to do. So it's not just like, okay, here's the assessment, but it requires them to say, here's what we're going to do about it, which gives those of you who have advocacy hats on a hook to be able to latch on to be able to say like, okay, the state said it was going to do this, and hold them accountable to that. Another thing that we're excited about with the vulnerable road user safety assessment is recognizing that while car collisions involving cars often happen in isolated areas or like hotspots, for the injuries and fatalities of people walking and biking or not in cars often happen along corridors. And so the VRU assessment is required to take that into consideration. But that's another one that I can follow up with more information rather than just verbally spouting off the specifics about that.
Great. Another question. Early in your presentation, you mentioned the clearinghouse. Can you explain what the clearinghouse is? Is that where TAP resources and data lives, or is it something else?
Yeah, so this is harkening back to 2005, the Safety Lou bill that originally created the Safe Routes to School program. And one of the things that it did was it created a clearinghouse, like a national center to organize information and data and research related to Safe Routes to School. So that's, for those of you that have been around for a while, that's our friends at the National Center for Safe Routes to School. And of course, there has not been federal funding for the clearinghouse after MAP 21. And so that is no longer federally supported through transportation alternatives, and it will continue to not be federally supported in this infrastructure bill.
Another good question, if and when this gets approved, how quickly do these changes happen? So when would we see things actually, get kicked off?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this is where I will say developing guidance for the Federal Highway Administration to develop guidance takes some time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. This bill is adding so much to their plate. In addition to all of the formula programs, it also created a whole bunch of new discretionary programs. And so for USDOT and FHWA to put out the guidance and all of these will take some time. Things like the funding amounts will take effect in the start of the fiscal year. And so this goes back to why I was saying we really encourage state DOTs to continue administering the Transportation Alternatives Program, even while the Federal Highway Administration is developing its new guidance, because the eligible projects haven't changed. And in partnership with the League of American Bicyclists, we are excited about pulling together and putting out resources specific for different sectors. So specifically for like advocacy organizations, specifically for state DOTs. We know that there's so much new money coming down the trail that we really want to support gaining access to that and implementing that. And so some of the things, for example, one of the things we're thinking about is encouraging state DOTs to reconsider previously submitted applications that maybe were the next two best applications to help start moving that money to local priorities and local communities as soon as possible, as soon as this passes.
Great. Let's see what else we have in here. Could you tell us more about how in the draft legislation, large MPOs would be able to obligate TAP funding for projects they select without waiting for states?
So they're in the bill, they're given they're given obligation authority. That's like stated in the bill. And if I were super savvy, I could like copy and paste it to you in the chat box right now, but maybe I see your name, I can pop your email in the chat box and I can send it to you, or I can put that on the blog as well.
Yeah, and like we said, we're saving all of the questions and answers. So we'll make sure that we follow up with you all. Let's see. Will local technical assistance funding be sub-allocated under the new bill in the same way that it was under the FAST Act based on 2009 population or an updated year?
Let's see. Wait, can you say that again? I'm trying to find this question.
Sure, it's Kyle.
Sorry,
Hi,
go ahead.
Kyle. Kyle James. It should be close to the bottom. Will local TA funding be suballocated in the same way that it was under the FAST Act based on 2009?
So
Updated year.
when you say, Kyle, I don't know whether when you say local TA funding, do you mean transportation alternatives, not the 5% technical assistance? So I'm going to answer this as if you're asking about the sub-allocation for transportation alternatives. So it will be sub-allocated under in this bill. I'm going to scroll back to the flow chart. I am a visual learner. So this is how it will be sub-allocated. It will go 41% to state DOTs and then 59% based on population. I don't know what year population it will be based on, I'm not sure. And then the other sub-allocation change for transportation alternatives is that a state could decide to wholly sub-allocate it to a local government, provided that it meets a number of financial management criteria. But if that didn't really answer your question, shoot me an email and I'll try to answer you.
Yeah, and Marisa, can you put your email in the chat so everybody has it?
Oh, absolutely.
And we can also send it out in our follow-up email as well.
Oh my God, I'm sending my personal email. Sorry, everyone. Yes, please feel free to email me.
Awesome. Okay, let me see if there's anything else that I missed in here. I know that we have a few things we're going to follow up with on the blog. Just one final, I guess, advocacy question. Somebody was asking if should advocacy efforts going forward be focused on pressuring the 2 Democratic senators who are holding up the process, and if so, how should these efforts be best carried out? Which I know you spoke a little bit about what advocates could do earlier on in the Q&A, but any other tips for action steps that people can take in these hopefully final days of negotiation that you haven't mentioned before?
Yeah, I think that if you live in a state where your senator is has an outsized influence on this process, then as a resident of that state, certainly reach out and convey what you are interested in. At this point, I think it's always great to call I mentioned, you should call your member of Congress. And in this case, for the physical infrastructure piece, it has already passed the Senate. So you could call your senator and thank them and state the provisions that you're particularly excited about. And in terms of how to move the process forward, you could call your House representative and say that you support these provisions in the physical infrastructure bill and the human infrastructure bill. And other than that, I really don't want to leave on a tone that's kind of like, oh, we're all waiting and seeing. But yeah, call your House member and express your support for the elements of the infrastructure bill that you support. And if you live in a state where your senator is actively negotiating related to human infrastructure, certainly call and express your interest or concerns.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marisa. We're almost at time. Really appreciate you, putting all this together and organizing, explaining a lot of really complicated topics in a way that can actually make sense for people. So thank you so much for doing that. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out a post-webinar survey along with the presentation slides and the recording. You can also keep an eye out for some follow-up blog posts from Marisa that will answer any questions that you all have. And again, please stay in touch with us as things move forward over the next few weeks, hopefully with this bill, and we should, fingers crossed, we'll have some more concrete answers in the next few weeks or so. So thank you all so much. We will be in touch and enjoy the rest of your day.